Very good. Good evening, everyone. This is lesson 5, which is our last all-team meeting. After this, and as soon as you've finished your rocket and have submitted your slides and your open rocket model, then we'll have a checkout interview. I'd like to have a checkout interview with every team individually before we fly. Send those things to me at least 24 hours and Kelly in advance of the proposed time for the checkout interview, and proposed times, more than one preferably. And I'll do my very best. It turns out that this time next week won't work for me. We're having an open house here and I'm quite involved in that. So I thought I could at least schedule one team at this time, and I can't schedule any teams at this time next week. It's hard for you to schedule your checkout until you're done with your rocket, but of course, once you have one scheduled, that might motivate you to finish your rocket. So let's just sort of take stock. You have a rocket. Hopefully it's pretty much all built. You have an nav bay. Hopefully that's pretty much all built. And if it's not all built, hopefully you are close and have a plan for getting that finished. You have a model, a simulation model. And as you build your rocket, you might want to tweak your model. In particular, when you're finished building your rocket, you should weigh it. And if it doesn't weigh what the simulation says it will weigh, then you should change the simulation, because the rocket is the rocket after all. And so what that means is that you use more or maybe less epoxy than they kind of guessed you would. So it's not unlikely that the rocket weight will be different, but it's best to simulate with the most accurate things you can. And so a possibility is just to go into the rocket model and override the weights and just say, I know, I built the rocket. It's actually 36 ounces, not 32 ounces. And oh, by the way, I can balance it on my finger with no motor. And in the simulation, I have no motor and it balances here. This is the actual center of gravity with no motor. You can override those things just to try and get the simulation as accurate as possible to the real vehicle. On the other hand, if the vehicle is not finished, you can't really do that. So finished as in it has all the avionics in it, it has the parachute in it, both of them, in fact, et cetera, et cetera. So here's what I want to do today. Well, what is this lesson? This lesson is sort of odds and ends, a whole bunch of things that we haven't spent much time talking about. And so we're going to go in lots of different directions. But perhaps before we do, and while I go and pull up the homework and the vocabulary, which is posted, but I just don't have it open right now. Let me turn it over to Kelly for a few minutes, and maybe you can make some updates about what you've been seeing, people have been reporting to you, what you've been doing, and then we'll get back to new material. Go ahead, Kelly. I'm not hearing you, Kelly.
I don't hear anything.
Oh, how about that? Does that work better?
Yep.
Do you want to pin me? I'm not seeing me as the. Thank you. I am seeing a couple teams have some really, really good builds, really high quality stuff. And some teams are running into some issues. And the teams that are running into the issues tend to be the teams that have not submitted a build timeline. So there are some things that were done in a little bit of a wonky fashion that ended up causing some issues. So grain of salt with that. It's always best to have the floor plan laid before you start laying the floor. And so keep that in mind for future builds. As far as the builds go, they're all looking pretty quality. Everybody seems to be on track to be able to fly. Keep in mind that we're less than 10 days away from flying, and that's going to be tentatively planned on the 28th. If for whatever reason there is weather event that keeps us from flying, I think Dr. Flaten can confirm or deny this, but I think we're going to aim for the 29th.
Probably true. There was no launch last Saturday, and I found out moments ago there will be no launch this Saturday either. And so I'm kind of scrambling because I was supposed to be out there with my class, my freshman class, this Saturday. So anyway, but yes, the backup date, we will always have a backup date, and the backup date typically is the next possible day, which would be Sunday. So maybe that works. Hopefully it works for at least, this is why you have a team. At least some members of the team could potentially go out on Saturday. At least some members, maybe different people, could potentially go out on Sunday. We're still a week away from knowing if they're going to fly on Saturday or not. I hope it's Saturday because that's my current plan.
Okay, and another thing that some teams have had an issue with, in their simulations, they're finding that they get a little bit of a red flag for when the main chute deploys. You should be having somewhere around 70 feet per second for that as the deployment. The reason that it's giving you a red flag is because our drogue chute is a little bit on the small side. It's 15 inches. It really wants 18 inches for that. It should be perfectly fine. They've flown in the past. The 70 feet per second that you should see in there is more than adequate for the parachute to come out with minimal chance of issues. So I don't see that as being the biggest problem personally, but if you're having issues where it's above 70 feet per second, you definitely want to look at what's going on in your simulation. One of the big problems that you could be running into is that you're either not delaying the motor. It has to be a 9-second delay from 14. The weight of your rocket is quite substantial. I don't expect anybody for whatever reason to be over 100 ounces. If you are, you've got a lot of epoxy going on. Even with a thick paint job, it should be without a motor, like right around 90 ounces. So if you're seeing that as being an issue, that might be contributing to the thing falling faster, which will lead it to having more feet per second on velocity. And then the last thing that could be a problem is if you have a drogue chute in there, but you haven't adjusted the size of the drogue chute. So if you haven't listed it as 15 inches, you've listed it's just 12 or whatever, make sure to correct that. But if you're getting around 70 feet per second, it should be good to go.
Let me throw in one more comment, and that is if you forgot to have your drogue chute come out, you have to tell it that here's a parachute, and oh, by the way, it's supposed to come out. For instance, the drogue chute should come out at apogee. Yep. Or if you tell it for the drogue chute to come out when the charge goes off, then you have to adjust the charge to be right. But if you just say apogee, it will ignore the charge and come out at apogee. But if you forget to tell it either one, it may not come out at all, in which case you're picking up speed all the way down until the main comes out, and you will be going too fast and you will probably break something in the simulation.
So like I said before, we had a chute deploy at 966 feet per second, and it's quite a lot. However, what ended up tearing was actually just the chute itself. The shock cord, perfectly fine. The heat shield got battered pretty hard, but the chute was not tear. I mean, if I really, really wanted to, I could have probably pieced it back together again. And that's at 966. So if you're seeing something that's a 70 and it's a red flag, don't worry about it. It's magnitudes below what I've seen happen, and I'm pretty confident that these chutes will be just fine.
So one of the things we're going to talk about today actually is increasing the strength of your drogue parachute, as opposed to making sure you're not going too fast when you pull your main parachute. I'll jump into that as soon as Kelly tells me that she's going to take a break. Are you done for the moment, Kelly? You got more going on?
I mean, I've just got updates on my build, but it looks like everybody's doing a good job. Everybody's on track. I'm liking where things are going. I'm confident that everybody is going to make it to the finish line. I do need some pictures and some simulations from people that have not provided those so far, but what I have seen of people's builds is good.
Okay, so let's just push on, but by all means, Kelly, jump in anytime you want to. Let me spotlight myself. And since you were talking about parachutes, here it is. There it is, the drogue parachute. It's not very big. And it's also not the right parachute for high power rocketry. I literally bought one that is for model rocketry, 15 inches across. And a couple things that I would suggest that you do. One is take the ends here, okay, and tie a knot above them. That just means that when you attach something, it won't wander around. So if you put a quick link here, it won't have a tendency to wander up toward the parachute, for instance. So there's thing one. Thing two is the way this parachute and many parachutes, especially for model rocketry, is built is that the lines come up and then they maybe fold over or maybe don't even fold over, but they're essentially attached only at the perimeter of the parachute. You really need your lines to go over the top, okay? So here's what I want you to do with your parachute. I want you to beef it up using the yellow string that I gave you. So here's another parachute, almost exactly the same, which also has white lines. But notice this one now has red lines, and I think we gave you maybe some yellow string. And the red lines actually go up to the parachute and over the top and down the other side. So now this parachute has two sets of lines, and the red lines, in this case, in particular, are way stronger. They have a much better grip on the canopy. Okay, so now I have two places that I need to grab onto at the bottom. I'm not getting rid of the white lines. I'm just adding some extra lines just to make sure it's stronger. In this case, I chose to sew the lines. I'm not very good at sewing, but I tried. What I did is I tied my lines together so that I didn't even pay attention to which line was which. I tied all 6 lines together, and then I sewed one line down to each attachment point, basically. And then I cut them off and tied them off at the bottom. So now I have 2 hooks at the bottom to attach to both sets of lines. This should be strong enough for high power rocketry use. And we'd like you to beef up your drogue parachute. Your main parachute should be fine because it's going to come out, well, hopefully at a not too high speed. But if the drogue comes out and you happen to be going high, you could possibly rip those lines off the drogue, and then you don't have a drogue. And if you don't have a drogue, then you probably won't have a main in a few moments. Okay. Share my screen. Let's take a look at what I've posted for this week. Here we go. Not very much. I posted some homework, some vocabulary, and what I call a simple ejection charge calculator. So this is one of many things we're going to talk about today, is how to decide how much gunpowder, literally, you need to put into the drogue section and the main section to pressurize them adequately. So we'll get to that in a moment. But let's take a look at the vocabulary first. And this will just lay out the many things that we need to talk about today. Odds and ends, more or less. Make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so this is not exactly in any specific order, but let me just comment that we hope you paint your rockets. And I know Kelly has been painting hers and has a great paint job, and you will all see it. If not on Zoom, you will see it in actuality when we fly. Some paints are claimed to be paint and primer together. I don't doubt the claim, but frankly, it really is better, I think, to sand your rocket and then prime your rocket and then paint your rocket. Basically, primer is something that sticks better than paint, and nothing actually will stick very well to the nose cone. So make sure you scuff up places before you paint them, and maybe scuff them up after you paint them if you're going to paint more than one coat. We already mentioned this, but I'll reiterate it, that you may not have your upper rail button in place yet. And the reason is the location of the upper rail button is a calculation. You should place the upper rail button essentially at the center of gravity, or allowed but not preferred. In fact, you could place it along the switch band. The reason that's handy is because you need the rail button to be really, really, really well aligned with the bottom rail button, the aft rail button. And if it's on the switch band, you can just rotate the parts of the rocket until they line up. So you don't have to worry too much about the alignment. But if you're going to place it at the center of gravity, which will be partway up your lower section, not as high as the switch band, then you will have to, and hopefully you've already done this. If you haven't already, if you have placed it, then hopefully you were very careful to get it well lined up. And if you haven't done it, that's where you want to do it, is to place it at the center of gravity of the rocket. We're certainly not below that. More or less, the rocket tends to pivot about the center of gravity, and yet the upper rail button is the first thing to leave the rail. And once it leaves the rail, then the rail can't really help you anymore, at least not hold you vertically and hold you straight. So you certainly don't want to put your rail button way at the tippy top of any rocket. And the reason is because that's the first thing to leave the rail, and then the rail just looks that much shorter.
Can I add something real quick?
Please do.
Don't forget that when you're doing your CG measurement, it's not from the back end of the rocket, it's from the front end of the rocket. So if it says 30 inches or 38 inches or 40, you're measuring from the tip of the nose cone downwards, not from the back end upwards.
Thank you for that reminder. That's very important. Okay. Let me do the following. You know what? Maybe I'll just show you some things as I walk through this, because this kind of tells you the things I want to talk about today anyway. So I happen to have a rocket with me. There it is. So I'm just going to point out some of these things while I'm looking at this actual rocket. Let me just get my camera a little bit closer to it. There we go. Okay, so you have your rocket.
Do you want to pin yourself? You're still in your document.
Oh, that's a good point. I can do that. Thank you. Let me stop sharing. And I think now my rocket is pinned. Yes, it is. Good. Okay, I just have to talk louder. If you can't hear me, let me know. I'm just pulling out my notes so I know what you could be looking at on the vocabulary sheet. So the next thing on the vocabulary sheet talks about putting loops into your, this is bugging me because I can't see myself. There we go. Putting loops into your cord. So for instance, let's talk about the rocket. The rocket, of course, is going to come apart here first. And so my recommendation, there is a drogue parachute inside of here, a very small one. It's been beefed up. It was inside of a flame protecting cloth. But the loop I'm talking about is right here. Basically, it's the fact that in this cord, I tied a loop and then I used the loop to hook things onto. And notice the loop is fairly close to the top, as in it's fairly close in this case to the ab bay and quite a ways away from the bottom. That just means that when I hang from the loop, as I will, the top section of the rocket, which is pretty substantial, doesn't strike the bottom section. So our recommendation is you put a loop in your recovery harness and keep it maybe within a foot or two of the top so that when you hang from that, you can keep the pieces that are dangling down from striking each other. Let's talk about separation. So I just separated the rocket. That's the very first separation during a flight. That's going to be a friction fit. You might even be able to see that I have some tape running vertically here. That's just because it was a little bit on the loose side when it was assembled. You want to make sure that things can be pulled apart or exploded apart, but that they don't just fall apart, okay? So we'll help you get a sense for a friction fit. And I always tell people you need to bring tape along so that if it's too loose, you can make it tighter with tape. But if it's too tight, you need to possibly make it looser with sandpaper. So bring sandpaper and tape, both. That's the first separation. It's below the switch band, okay? Now the second separation during the flight, so now I'm talking about separations. The second separation, this is a friction fit, is going to be the nose cone coming off. But here's a problem, and that is if the nose cone is a friction fit and the upper part here is a friction fit and the lower part here is a friction fit, when you blow off the hind end of the rocket, it's going to yank the back. And when it yanks the back, all the front separations will come apart. Don't do that. What we're going to do is we're going to pin the front separations together to prevent them from coming apart when you yank the back, which always happens first. So the way we're pinning it together is I don't want this to separate during the flight at all. This I want to stay together. So I want the ab bay and the upper section to stay together for the whole flight. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to install rivets. So you have some rivets, they're black. What you need to do is drill a hole that goes through the airframe and through the coupler tube below it. Put in the center part of the rivet. The rivet has two parts, the center part, and then push the button in, which splays the center part and makes the rivet hold tight. Then to get it back out again, you extract the button. And once the button is out of it, then the center part will not be splayed anymore, and then you can extract that. So rivets don't break during the flight, but they can be removed if necessary. We'll use the rivets to make sure this does not ever separate during flight. I don't want that to separate. On the other hand, I do want this to separate, just not too early.
Do you mind if I add a point?
Please do.
So with the rivets, when you drill the holes for the rivets, don't drill them to the diameter of the little cylinder part. You know, you've got the mushroom looking part and the cylinder part. You've got this little guy, and you've got the cylinder, or the mushroom. The little cylinder, don't drill the hole to the diameter of that, because if you do, when you try to push the other part in, those two parts don't have anywhere to splay open. So drill it slightly bigger than that, and then it has the ability to move out when you push the center in. So what I do with those things is I actually take the whole thing, I push it in all the way, and then I measure how much it's splayed out, and I make sure that my measurement is between that larger diameter and the diameter of the actual little cylinder.
Okay, keep an eye on the chat. I see that someone's trying to chat with you and I'm not paying
And
attention.
it just happened.
That's fine. Yeah, but thank you. That's good. So you should practice with rivets. You should also practice with shear pins. So what is a shear pin? A shear pin is just a nylon machine screw. So in some sense, it's like a rivet. It doesn't have two parts, it only has one, and it's intended to break if you apply enough force. So what we're going to do is up here, we're going to actually pin this together with shear pins. You have some shear pins, they're white. And the idea is when you pressurize this, you will break the shear pins and then this will come off. So the idea is this is more than a friction fit. Just make sure when you drill in with a shear pin hole, for a shear pin, you want the shear pin just to be able to press in. It should be fairly tight, but you don't have to screw it in. Don't hit the window. Basically the window, that means there's nothing underneath for you to reach in. You're trying to attach the airframe to the plastic. Okay, so the shear pins have to go on either side of the window. I'd recommend either 2 or 3 shear pins, and then we will calculate your explosive charge appropriately to break 2 or 3 shear pins. I think Kelly's planning to fly with 3. I would be inclined to fly with 2. Either one is fine, but just make sure you know what you're doing so that we can calculate your explosive charges properly. So rivets here, shear pins here, friction fit first. Friction fit first, shear pins at the upper explosion, and the rivets never break. Okay, so that's the separations. Now, it turns out that your rocket will actually want to separate on its own for a variety of reasons. Here's one reason your rocket might want to separate, and that is that the very lowest section here is less aerodynamic than the top. This one has a camera on it. Of course, there's the upper edge of the fins also. Your fins are wider than the fins on this particular rocket. This one has narrow fins, yours have wider fins. Either way, this thing has more air drag on it. And if you think about it, if there's air drag on the bottom of the rocket and less air drag on the top, the rocket will have a tendency to do what's called drag separation. That's why you need a really pretty solid friction fit, because if you don't have a solid friction fit and it just wants to fall apart, it will actually drag separate and it will come apart during the ascent. You want to keep the thing together until you explode it and make it come apart then. So tight friction fit will avoid drag separation. On the other hand, here's another way your rocket might want to come apart, and that is the air inside the rocket is at atmospheric pressure for the surface, but you are going to some altitude where the atmospheric pressure is lower, at least a little bit lower. And so the air that's inside the upper section here will actually try to expand. And when it expands, it might leak out, but if it fails to leak out because you have a pretty tight rocket, then it will actually push against the ave, and it will push against the nose cone, and it might manage to push the rocket apart. Okay, so this is not drag separation, this is pressurization, natural pressurization. And so the way to avoid this is to pin it. This is only a small force, relatively speaking, and so if you have shear pins and rivets, they will absolutely hold it together. On the other hand, the friction fit could be pushed apart by the air pressure. That would be possible. So what we're going to do, and it's right here on this rocket, if you can see it, there's a hole right there. That's a bleed hole. So the idea is that's a hole that allows the air pressure in here to be relieved if it needs to. So a little bit of air will come out. When I pressurize it, I want to be able to momentarily hold a high pressure and get the rocket to come apart. So I don't want many bleed holes and just a sieve down here, but I want at least one bleed hole, and I'm going to only put it in the bottom section, close to the top of the bottom section, so it doesn't get covered by the parachute that gets stuffed down and things like that. The bleed hole is to avoid this natural pressurization separation possibility. On the other hand, you do have things in your rocket that need to know about the outside air, okay? Electronics in particular. So you're using an AIM USB, so that needs to know about the outside air. You're also using a altimeter 2, so that needs to know about the outside air pressure, because both of them are going to make measurements and guess at altitudes based on changes in air pressure. So what we need to do is we need to vent certain parts of the rocket. So for instance, The AIM USB is inside of the av bay. And so what I need to do is I need to drill some holes in the av bay. And in this particular case, there's multiple holes, one here, one here, one here, one here. There's 4 holes actually in this switch band, and they're all at the same level. So air doesn't have a tendency to come out of one and go into another, because then you could get wind blowing around in your av bay. That would be bad. Okay. So multiple holes, that's to keep the internal pressure in the av bay similar to the outside pressure. So the AIM USB that's inside there knows what's going on. On the other hand, you get to decide where to put your altimeter 2. I wouldn't bother putting vent holes in the upper section for pressurization purposes, but if the altimeter 2 is in the upper section, then you might need to put some holes in there to let it know what's going on. This rocket flew with the altimeter 2 in the nose cone, and so very hard to see, but there's actually a bunch of holes in the nose cone. There's one, there's one, there's one. There's a whole bunch of holes along this same level. They're not in the shoulder, because then they would get covered up when you put the nose cone on. But this nose cone is vented, and if the altimeter 2 is in there, we might hold it in with packing peanuts or something. That allows it to have a crack at the outside atmospheric pressure. So these are sometimes called static portholes. There's a calculation in the book that tells you how big these holes should be. And the calculation is just kind of a rule of thumb. It more or less says, calculate the volume in cubic inches, divide by 400, and then that number is the diameter of a single hole, although my recommendation is always to have several holes. And so I often put several 1/8-inch holes, even though the calculation might tell me I only need 1. Or I might need 1 that's a bit bigger than 1/8 inch, so I just put 2 1/8-inch holes, and then I can consider myself good to go. Okay, I think that's all I need to look at. Oh, let me just say one more thing. And that is, at the top of the avionics bay, that's where we're going to put an explosive charge. And at the bottom of the avionics bay, we'll put an explosive charge there. So what that does mean is I do need to be able to get my avionics bay out so I can reach the top. That's when the rivets are out. And then to fly, I'll put it back in and put the rivets in to make sure it stays in place. But don't glue those together, because if you glue those together, you won't be able to reach something that's very important, and that's the top surface of the avionics bay where I need to place explosive charges. Okay. I am almost through my vocabulary. You might want to just pull up the vocabulary yourself, and that way I can show you other things on the screen. The next thing on the vocabulary list, the concepts list, says, how are you going to figure out how much black powder you need, how much explosive charge you need? And the answer is we're going to calculate it as in the amount of charge necessary to pressurize a certain volume in the rocket. So let me show you. Let me go back to share screen.
And just remember, if you're using, we need to know, when you give us your black powder charge numbers, we need to know if you're using a piston or if you're using a heat shield.
Good point. That doesn't change the volume very much, but since the piston has more mass than a heat shield, we'll probably beef up the charge a little bit to compensate for the existence of the piston. So many motors come with 1.3 grams of charge, sometimes 1.5 grams of charge, and that's often appropriate for a rocket about this size, but not always. And sometimes the rocket this size actually needs less, in which case we might give it less, and we'll use the 1.3 grams in the motor to back us up, to give us an extra oomph, just in case our 1.0 grams didn't do the trick. So this is called ejection charge calculation. And here is the simple ejection charge calculator right here. Let's see what happens if I, that's not too bad. It opened up in Google. And let's see if it's live. So the blue in this particular ejection charge calculator is where you tell it details of your rocket. So our rocket is a 3-inch diameter rocket. Okay. And let's say I'm interested in the volume. So for instance, from the bottom of the av bay to the top of the motor centering rings, there's a volume in the rocket that needs to be pressurized. we'll put a drogue parachute in this area, but we need to pressurize the area to separate the av bay from the bottom of the rocket, okay? And so you need to measure how long that is in inches. I'm going to hazard a guess that it's 10 inches. Don't quote me on that because I didn't measure it. I don't even have that rocket. You've got the rocket, I don't, okay? So it's a 3-inch diameter rocket, and I'm gonna say it's 10 inches long. And so between 3-inch diameter and 10 inches long, that gives me 7.1 square inches for area, and then multiply that by 10, and now I'm up to 70.7 cubic inches. That's the volume I need to pressurize. Now, how much pressure do I want? Well, I usually don't change this number. I'll just leave it at 15, but basically that means I want to put 15 PSI, pounds per square inch, extra on top of the original atmospheric pressure. And what this will do is it will push against the other end of, in this case, the end of the av bay with 106 pounds. That sounds like a lot. That's actually considered normal. And guess what? You only need 0.55 grams, less than 1 gram of powder to get that much pressure. On the other hand, if this had been the upper section, so let me go to the upper section and let me pretend the upper section is 15 inches long, and this will automatically say, okay, now I'm up to 0.82 grams. But remember, the upper section is harder to get apart because it has shear pins in it, and each shear pin will take a bunch of pounds of pressure to just break the shear pin by itself. So I go farther down, and I see a place for a shear pin adjustment. So let's assume that I put in 2 shear pins, and it says, oh, by the way, rather than 0.8 grams, now you're up to 1.36 grams. In other words, just breaking 2 shear pins was itself a significant change to the amount of powder I need. And if I'm up to 3, now it actually doubles the charge. Instead of 0.8, it's 1.6. So in other words, the number of shear pins can make a big difference on how much charge you need. Use this calculator to figure it out. At the very bottom, it talks about Pyrodex and the fact that Pyrodex is a gunpowder substitute, and therefore it doesn't burn quite as thoroughly. And so sometimes I will increase just by a 15% increase if I'm using Pyrodex. I'm not using Pyrodex for this project. I'm actually using genuine gunpowder, genuine black powder. Notice that a motor comes with 1.3 grams, but if you need 1.88 grams, for instance, then you need to add extra. So this final calculation is how much more do you need besides what the motor probably came with. Our motors come with 1.5 grams. And so if we need 0.5 or 1 gram, we'll be fine. If we need 2 grams, we're short, and we'll add extra powder. We can add extra powder on top of what is provided. So do your ejection charge calculations with this spreadsheet. Kelly?
Keep in mind that that charge that he's talking about comes from the motor, so it's going to deploy the drogue chute, not the upper section.
Right. So that's why you need electronics, because only with electronics can you sense that you're getting close to the ground, and then can you fire the second charge. We're actually going to fire the first charge at apogee, and if that doesn't work, then the motor will back us up, and then that will get our drogue out. And then as we come down closer to the ground, then we will use the electronics for sure to fire the second charge and get our main to come out. And you need to calculate this independently because the amount of pressurization volume is different for the drogue section and the main section. I pretended it was 10 inches and 15 inches. Guaranteed those are not the right numbers. You have to measure the numbers for yourself. And remember that a fraction of the length of the airframe is taken up by the shoulder of the nose cone, and a fraction is taken up by the av bay. And so it's a little shorter than you might expect. But don't take out the fact that there's a bulky parachute taking up the volume. Forget that. Do the pressurization for the entire volume. There will be a parachute in there, but you have to pressurize the entire volume, so calculate it as if it's empty. Only 2 more things on my vocabulary list. Stop share. One is igniter versus EMatch. Basically, an EMatch, I have one with me. I'm going to put on some safety goggles, not because I'm worried, but just good practice. If you're handling EMatches, and especially if you're handling EMatches and gunpowder, good idea to put on safety goggles. This is what an EMatch looks like when you first get it. It's got a long wire. It's got a little cap. You have to make sure you take that cap off because that is the business end right there. And so don't forget to take this off, because I want gunpowder to touch that, or I want that to touch a certain part of the motor to get the motor ignited. It used to be an igniter, was a sort of a beefed up one of these. So this is good for starting gunpowder explosive charges, and you need a bigger one to start a fire in a motor. Motors are getting better. Motors these days, first of all, motors always come with one igniter, but it often looks just about like an E-match, and sometimes it is in fact an E-match, because the motor is able to be started with the same kind of a spark that this will cause. What we will do, and I actually have one left over, probably should have this left over, but that's all right. Here is an E-match. You'll notice that I've cut off all the wires except for a couple inches, because I don't need a lot of wire. It comes with a lot of wire. You don't need it. And then this has gunpowder inside of a glove finger, so like a nitrile glove, 1.0 grams of gunpowder or something, and then wrapped in tape. And then this is what's going to stick in that cup. So the idea is this sticks in the cup, this bends over and attaches to the wires, which then go down to your avionics bay. So that's approximately what your ejection charge will look like. And you say, I need 1.2 grams, and I will give you something that looks just about like that. And then you will install it wearing safety goggles. Perhaps only one person handles all the gunpowder. Actually, I'm going to handle the powder, but once it's contained like that, only one person perhaps handles it and installs it in the rocket. Last thing on my list is grinding. And so it turns out that when you have a motor, let me show you, here's a spent motor, so it's about only half the weight originally. There's the nozzle. I can see this little lip here. That's what keeps it from sliding into the motor mount tube, so that prevents it from going in too far. And then you have things to hold it from going out as well. But this is the nozzle end, and this is the explosive charge end. So for this particular kind of motor, what you do is it comes with this empty. You reach inside of here with a grinding tool. I happen to have it right with me. So the grinding tool literally just has a drill bit on it, but then it has notches on it so you can tell exactly how far the drill bit will stick in, and you stick it inside of here and you grind it, removing some of the material so that it will burn through more quickly. There's a chunk of slowly burning delay grain, and this will delve into it so that when you start one end on fire, the fire pops out the other end more quickly if you have removed some of it. So first you grind it. Let's say you would grind it to 9 seconds. If it starts at 14, this is a 115 motor. Yours is 195, so it may be different. I don't think so, though. If this starts at 14 seconds, it says 14A on the label. So that means that we need to remove 5 seconds worth from 14, remove down to 9 is what I want. Okay, this is the optimal delay as shown to you by OpenRocket. And then once you have ground it down, then what you'll do is you'll take the powder that comes with the motor and you will pour it into this well. There's also a little washer that goes in there to keep it from falling in too far. Okay, put in the washer, pour in the powder, 1.5 grams, or we might negotiate a different number, but let's assume we use all of it. And then you put a plug on the top, and that is your motor eject. And then you will have, let's say, your 1.0 gram drogue charge and your 1.5 gram motor eject, which is bigger, which is good. So this goes off, and if it separates, fine. And if it doesn't separate, well, let's try harder with this one. Okay, I have put away my E-matches and my explosives. So that's it. Let's talk quickly about the homework. So I was just showing you the vocabulary, this vocabulary here. Just went through all these notes. Let's take a quick look at the homework. The homework just talks about the things that you need to do, still need to do. Okay, so there's some more reading. We're getting close to the end of the book, frankly, but I would suggest that you have somebody, if not everybody, do the reading in the high-power book. If you're going to paint your rocket, you'll need to provide your own spray paint. Don't get yourself in trouble with painting where you should not paint. They always take my birth date when I buy paint. I think they think young people don't do good things and old people do. I'm not sure that's true, but somebody thinks that. You might have to send your advisor to buy paint if they won't sell it to you. Exercises, finish up your open rocket. I already mentioned this. Make sure that it does match the real rocket. And if it doesn't, you can do overrides to make it match more carefully. And then, you need to also finalize a time. I'm willing to start talking about that as early as tonight. Although I can't stay late after this discussion because I am scheduled to be at Augsburg University within half an hour to start my next project. Some of you are involved in that. That's the Intercollegiate Challenge, which has nothing to do with rockets and all about solar panels. But let us know when you have a time or 2 or 3 in mind for a checkout interview. Submit the documents and make sure your rocket is ready. And then we'll talk through your rocket, probably on Zoom or in person if you ask for specifically in person. This will be with me or with Kelly, probably with me. I think Kelly is busier than me right now, and that's fine. We need to get this done before we fly, and that means we have to get this done no later than Friday of next week, and I would prefer earlier than Friday of next week. Here are some things that remain on the building side. Strengthen your drogue chute, already talked about that. Finish your AVB. That goes without saying, right? Final tweaks, bleed holes, vent holes, loops, quick links, flame protectors. Calculate where your upper rail button will go and install that. Glue it in on the inside. That way you can take off the out and put on the out and it won't fall in on you.
Can I add to that?
Please do.
So when you glue it on the inside, make sure that you take a piece of wax paper and you shove it through the threaded hole so that you don't get any of the epoxy sticking into the hole itself. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to screw the rail button in.
Okay, fair enough. On the other hand, if you get some epoxy in there and then you put the screw in right away, well, you won't get the screw out, but perhaps you never have to get that screw out. Having the button roll is kind of a nicety, but it's not in fact required. If you want yours to roll and you don't happen to have Loctite, that's okay. I've got Loctite. We can do that. It takes 10 minutes to dry, which means we can do that on the day of the launch if you really want. Do your calculations for your delay grain timing. Get the optimal delay off of open rocket. Do your calculations for ejection sizes and let me know because I'll be preparing the ejection charges for you. And make sure that you take care to include the number of shear pins. You'll put shear pins in the upper section. EEE will not allow you to put shear pins in the lower section. That is required to be a friction fit so it comes apart more easily. Practice folding and installing parachutes. I want to do that right now just so you see what that could look like. And then you'll get to, actually, I'll do that as soon as I finish my list and I'll go back to it. Here's a few other things. If you are flying a camera, some people are, some people are not. It would look about like this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see me better. And I will just look at my list of things to do on paper. Here we go. So if you're flying a camera in a 3D printed mount, the camera is inside there. It would be mounted this way so that it's aerodynamic from the top and it views out the bottom. My recommendation is to have that fairly low in your rocket. The lower it is, the less it impacts your stability, frankly. So there it is, looking out the bottom. And then make sure you understand what buttons need to be pressed and what lights are going to flash. And I'll tell you right now, those two biggest things, those aren't even buttons. Those are just heat sinks. Okay, the buttons are over here and you need to turn it on and then you need to start recording. It's second to touch. So make sure you know how to do that if you're flying a camera. If you're not flying a camera and you want to, there's still time, but you just have to print one of those and get it glued on, and then I will lend you the camera. A siren. You have a siren. We might decide on the day to fly the sirens or not, or you might just want to install it. The way the siren works very quickly is there's two parts to it. I have them taped together here, the main part and the moving part, shall we say. And so the main part is a battery compartment. And if I turn the switch to on, and the way that noise turns off is you either switch the switch back or you touch this against the side. When I touch that against the side, it's magnetic and it notices it's there. So the way to use this is tape this to one part of your shock cord, tape that to another part very carefully and tightly, and then tape the two together very loosely, maybe with blue tape that can rip. And then when the recovery harness extends, it starts to go off. My recommendation is you put this into your drogue compartment, not your main compartment. That's because I'm more confident you'll get your drogue and less confident you'll get your main, and I'd like to be able to hear that either way.
And
So there's the siren.
it is quite loud, but the tone does not come through Zoom. Just so you guys
That-
know, it was on, but the tone doesn't come through.
That must be Zoom filtering because it's very loud, but that happened to us before where there were certain tones, the beeping of the altimeter. Zoom must filter things that it doesn't think are human voices, and that was not a human voice. Hey, guess what? You have one. Practice with it. Here's something you need to think about. Before we fly, we're actually going to blow the front end off your rocket just to make sure we can actually break those shear pins. So think about how you can install a charge on the front end of the rocket, front end of the out bay, and then get the wires to that charge outside of the rocket with everything closed up and pinned together. And the reason is I want to manually touch a battery to the outside. I'm not going to fire this with the avionics at all. I'm going to fire this manually. So here's my recommendation, and that is you have a hole in the top end of your av bay for wires to go through. So take a charge and run the wire, keep the long wires, run the wires through the top of the av bay into the av bay, and then out the side hole. The side hole, it's like, yeah, you've got several side holes. Those are the vent holes. That will just get the wire to the charge out in your hand, and then we might extend that so we can stand farther back, and we'll touch a 9-volt battery to it, and we'll make sure we can blow the rocket apart on the ground. And assuming that works, if it doesn't work, we'll try it again until it works, possibly by increasing the charge. Once it works, we'll clean things up, especially if you have a piston, make sure it still slides after you've done this. So clean things up, and then we will load the thing with the avionics so that the avionics fires the charges, not manually. So think about how you're going to get that E-match wire out of the rocket. You have an altimeter too. You know how to use it. Plan where to place it. My recommendation is probably in the nose cone or maybe hanging from the nose cone. Okay. A radio beeper. We might fly radio beepers. We might not. But here's what a radio beeper looks like. And so if we end up flying them, I would give them to you on the day. They're not very big. This also, I would suggest, could easily go into the nose cone because you've got that hole in the nose cone to let you put things into it. So this could go in all the way up to the top. This goes in the bottom. You have to put a battery in, a button battery first. And then to make sure it doesn't rattle around, we'll pack the nose cone with packing peanuts. And to make sure it doesn't fall out, we'll cover the hole. That's important. Don't forget to cover the hole in the nose cone before you fly. If there's anything in there, packing peanuts, altimeter 2, radio beeper, any of that stuff, make sure you don't lose it during the flight. Okay, that's the end of my list. Now I'm going to go back to parachute. So let me just point this back at my rocket. In fact, I want to point it at the ground in front of my rocket so you can see me. I'm going to try to make some space here and fold a parachute. So first of all, what parachute? Well, how about I take the main parachute just because that's the biggest one. I can see my camera's falling over, sorry. Love these little tiny tripods. That'll do. Okay, so let me get my main parachute out. There it is. Oh, bye-bye. So here's my recommendation. And this will have to be redone on the day of the flight because parachutes kind of get used to being packed up and then they don't want to come out. So here's my parachute. I'm going to open it up. I'm going to fluff it open. I'm just going to make sure it's as able. This one is kind of sticking to itself. This one happens to have a spill hole in it. That's okay. So here's what I'm going to do for this parachute. I'm going to lay it down, fold it in half. And I'm going to lay it down so that the lines come out of it right next to each other. So notice those two lines are next to each other. And then here in the middle, there are two lines next to each other. And on this end, there are two lines next to each other. And then I'm going to fold these until these two lines are on top of these two lines. And I'm going to fold this so these two lines are on top. So ultimately, this is what I'm aiming for, is a parachute where all the lines are coming out right here, all of them. Okay? So now that I have all the lines coming out at one spot, I'm going to take the rest of the lines down to the quick link, and lay them on top of the parachute. There they are, laid on top of the parachute, not wrapped around, but on top of the parachute. Quick link is still outside the parachute. And then I'm going to fold this over to cover them up. Make this fairly narrow. And then I'm going to essentially roll this up. What I want to do is I want to roll this up so that it has a diameter definitely smaller than the rocket, so it can slide into the rocket fairly nicely. And then I have my flame protector. Yours might be square. And I just need to get this thing pretty well protected, at least from, in this case of the main parachute, charge explosion coming from one side. For the drogue, you might want to cover both sides, but I'll just cover one side. So let's assume the explosion is coming from this side. So I'm going to fold this over and then fold this over and then wrap this around. And there it is, pretty well protected, especially from explosions coming from this side. I could even fold this over and protect it from the other side too. Now that it's protected, now I just want to install it. So here is the part of the rocket it came out of. There's the av bay. There's the upper part. So I'm going to take it, here it is in view, and I'm going to slide it down there. Actually, I'm going to change my mind a little bit. I'm going to take all of the, sorry, this is hard to do, all the recovery harness that's below the parachute and stick that in first. And the reason is I don't want that stuff to get above the parachute and then the parachute can't come out because it's held back by a recovery harness that's on the wrong side. So recovery harness below the parachute, then the recovery harness that's above the parachute. I'm going to slide it in farther. I'm just poking it in here. Whoa, man, I poked it in so far that my av bay started to come off because it's not riveted on. So there it is. It's all the way down. And then the rest of the recovery harness. And then I rivet, shear pin, ready to go, ready to fly. And then when it explodes during the flight, late in the flight, so here's my nose cone. The nose cone comes off. It's driven out by quite a bit of force, and that slides out very easily. And it opens up, and there it is. Whoa, hard to see. There it is, ready to catch wind and lower me gently down. So we'll go over that again on the day of the flight, but you should practice. You should think about it. Think about getting ready to have your parachute packed, both of them. And this particular rocket isn't particularly tight. Sometimes it's very tight. You have very little space and a big parachute and you're really trying hard. And that's when you get in trouble because it won't come out because you jammed it in there so tightly. This rocket should be fine, but it does take some practice. Okay, I think I'm out of things to say and we're almost out of time. Is there any pressing questions that I can answer while we're together? And if not, you can certainly be in touch with both Kelly and I, and we're happy to answer questions asynchronously.
Also, one point on my part, if you want to pin me for a second.
Yep.
So, am I pinned?
I'm trying.
Okay.
I don't know why you're not. Go ahead.
I still see you on the main.
Now you're good.
Okay. So when you're doing your paint job, you'll notice I put my CP, I put this slightly above the center of pressure or center of gravity. I always do that. But ultimately this is not good enough. A little piece of paper or something on there, like a little sticker, isn't going to be good enough. You have to physically mark your points on the actual body of the rocket. So I'm going to be painting these on after I'm done doing touch-ups and stuff. It's a little rough right now, but once you're ready to go, you need to have this on here and you need to have this on here. You need your center of pressure and you need your center of gravity physically on the rocket itself. So when you bring it to the safety officer, they can see that it has a static margin greater than one body length.
One body diameter.
Yeah, not body length. Jeez. Yes, one body diameter.
No, this is true. They will ask you questions, and that will be one of the questions. Where's your center of pressure? Where's your center of mass? And the best answer is right here. See, it's marked.
Yeah. And I've gotten this question from a couple people. When you put on your upper rail button, when you have the inside, you'll notice, let me push that down a little bit. It's very smooth in there, but it is epoxy, but it's not going to be in the way. So there's nothing that's going to cause it to snag on the line or snag it on the parachute or the flame protector. So make sure if you're going to put anything in there, like any epoxy or anything, that it's mostly smooth across there, that there's nothing that's going to hitch up the stuff coming out of there.
That's a good point. Other rail buttons that aren't quite as cool as these ones screw in, and when they screw in, they usually have a point on the end, of course, and that point can get you in trouble because it can snag things like pistons for sure, parachutes perhaps, that are trying to move past it. So these ones are nice, but definitely bear in mind that they need to be smooth on the inside so they don't interfere with things that are moving around inside the rocket. Okay, so last call. I'm not going to take the sorry, don't have time. I got to run. You need to send me and Kelly suggestions of when you would like your checkout interview to be as soon as you possibly can choose time. So this requires, and maybe you've already done this, talking to your teammates. I guess I would suggest that you send those to me, if not today, then tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, then over the weekend for sure. Do not wait till next week to send me these things because times are going to fill up. Okay. And we've got a bunch of teams. And so if some people say I can do it on Monday or Wednesday, this is great. And if everybody says I have to do it on Friday, I'm going to say, sorry, there's only one of me and there's only one of her, and it's not going to work. So I can't have everybody asking for last minute. Get your time scheduled, get your time chosen, get your time approved, and then get your rocket ready. Remember, the rocket needs to be ready. The slides need to be submitted a day before. Hopefully you've been working on those slides. And then the calculation should be done, so you can answer questions. And there's one more thing that you're supposed to do before you do your checkout interview. I forget what it was. Anyway, I'm sorry?
Simulations?
Yes, simulations. Make sure that your simulation is good to go so it can support your choice, in particular your choice for location of upper rail button and also your choice for how much your motor needs to get ground out.
And don't forget to send that to both myself and to Dr. Flaten.
Quick question, Kelly, and that is, I see there are 7 chats and I haven't read any of them, but have you read them all and are you good to go?
Yeah, we're good to go. I just made a joke about your burrito wrapping being a chipotle burrito. It was pretty bad.
It was pretty bad, but that's good. I like that.
Shoots didn't deploy. It hit the ground pretty hard.
Okay, well, everybody, I'll be in touch. You will be in touch. You will be in touch with me with your requests for, oh, one more thing. Once you, I would not necessarily don't let this slow you down, but I would suggest once you've chosen and found a time, you tell your advisor and you encourage your advisor, whether they've been involved or not, you encourage your advisor to try to join that call. I think they will be pleased to see what you've done. So encourage your advisor. This is not a requirement. Maybe it's a requirement to at least invite them, but encourage your advisor to attend your checkout call. Okay, good night.
Thank you.